This is rule of law news. I want to explain about the right to travel, why the public has a right to travel without a license, registration, or insurance, as long as they're not operating in commerce. Now, I'll explain the history of it, at least briefly. The U.S. Supreme Court has made multiple rulings or decisions stating that, pretty much to the gist of, that any member of the public has a right to travel without license, without insurance, without a registration. Now, the reason why they made that ruling is you have a right to be let alone. You have a right under the Fourth Amendment to be let alone, not to be stopped by the police unless you're committing a violation of law. Now, statutes are not law. Statutes, codes, rules, regulations are not laws. They have the force of law, but they're not law. Now, the reason why is because the Supreme Court made rulings, and these rulings pretty much state that the public has a right to travel to and from wherever they want to go. As long as they're not operating in commerce, they don't need a license, registration, or insurance. If they're operating in commerce by picking up passengers, discharging passengers, delivering stuff for commercial purposes, they need a registration, insurance, and licensing. A license, when a state or a municipality licenses somebody, it is they're authorizing them to do something that they would not be authorized to do without a license. In other words, what they're doing is granting the person they're issuing a license a privilege to operate a motor vehicle. Now, the reason why that's improper, as long as it's not operating in commerce, if you're just driving to and from and you're traveling around, but it's not for commercial purposes, you're considered a traveler. Under the Black's Law Dictionary, many years ago, they perverted it years later, but a traveler is somebody who drives, is somebody who travels. When you drive a vehicle from Black's Law Dictionary, which is the original meanings, you're operating in commerce. So if you say you're a driver, then it means you're operating in commerce. So the police officers are not supposed to be pulling you over if you are operating as a traveler. If you're operating with a traveler, you're not required to have a license, registration, or insurance. Now, the reason why the police pull you over and issue summonses because they've been improperly trained. Some of them actually know what they're doing is wrong, and what they do is they're gathering revenue. They're revenue enforcement officers. They're getting revenue for the municipality. Now, the reason why is the police officers are not supposed to do that is because the U.S. Supreme Court made these rulings about the right to travel. There was no decisions that are inconsistent with the rulings for the right to travel if you're not operating in commerce. Now, what the police do is that they issue a summons and they say, well, you have a license, so if you have a license, it's considered a privilege. Now, most people are duped into it that if you have a license, then you're not allowed to. If you have a license, it means that you're granted a privilege to operate a motor vehicle. Now, why would you be granted a privilege to operate a motor vehicle if it's your God-given right to travel to and from, as long as it's not in commerce, without insurance, registration, or any license? Now, the reason why is the municipalities have tricked the public into believing that you need all these requirements. So what they did is they took your right and they converted it into a privilege. Now, if you consent to that, then what happens is it means that even though you don't understand, you contracted. You contracted by getting a license. You contracted to operate as if you're in commerce, really, because now you have to follow all the rules. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court made multiple rulings. One of the rulings is that any government entity could not, or shall I say, is prohibited from converting a right to a privilege. But can they? Sure they can. If they're corrupt, they can. And this is what has happened. They've converted our right into a privilege, and then they charged us for it. The main reason why they did it is so they could charge you. So they could charge you for a license, charge you for registration, and then help the insurance companies out. Now, a lot of people would say, well, okay, what would happen if we did follow what the Supreme Court said? Well, first of all, the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court's rulings are the supreme law of the land. Any rule, statute, code, ordinance, regulation, any type of law that is inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution and the decisions that were made from the U.S. Supreme Court are null and void on their face. Now, the police officers are not supposed to be enforcing these statutory laws. These statutory laws are inconsistent with common law. Common law is natural law, God's law. They call it God's law, or it's your inalienable rights, pretty much. Now, you're allowed to do, under common law, you're allowed to do whatever you want as long as you don't injure another party. So if you assault your neighbor, then you're in violation of the law. If you are involved in an accident and it's your fault, you're negligent. So you're a negligent operator of a motor vehicle. Now, if being that you're negligent, you're the proximate cause of the injury, the damage, and so you have to pay for the damages. So what would normally happen if you didn't have an insurance registration and licensing, you'd be sued. You'd be sued for the money damages, and then you'd have to pay out, or you could get a bond, and it would be almost like insurance. You get a bond actually, and they pay out. But the thing is that the police officers cannot follow their oath of office, most of them anyway, especially if they're doing traffic duty or assigned to traffic duty or doing some of the duties of that, because a police officer is enforcing the statutes, rules, codes, ordinances that are inconsistent with the Constitution, U.S. Constitution. Now, the police officer, when he pulls you over and you claim an excuse that you didn't know the law, he'll tell you, okay, ignorance is no excuse of the law. But here's the question. Well, why is ignorance an excuse for him not following the law? Police officers, they're granted privileges, qualified immunity to violate the law if it's not clearly established. Now, even if it is clearly established and they claim it's not, then he has leeway. Well, why should he have leeway? If you expect the average citizens or average members of the public to know the law backwards and forwards, why shouldn't the police know it? Well, the reason why is because obviously the system is corrupt. If you can apply the standard to the public, it should be applied equally to the police. Now, do the police know that you have a right to travel? Well, some may know, but many of them don't. Then the question comes down to, well, how are they violating their oath of office if they unknowingly are doing it? Well, if they cannot turn a willful blind eye to the truth, put their head in the sand and say they didn't know anything, because there's so much information out there that they should know or should have known that what they're doing is in violation of the oath of office. When they swore to an oath of office, they swore to follow the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution of the states or the states in which they're operating in, the local law or ordinances and stuff like that. Now, also rules, regulations, statutes. Here's the problem. If those statutes, rules, regulations are inconsistent with the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution or the state constitutions, and it's in the U.S. Constitution's, U.S. Supreme Court's interpretations, then the police are not authorized to carry out those state actions or official actions. If they do, what effectively they're doing is they're violating the oath of office. Now, if they're violating the oath of office, they're becoming a criminal. They're becoming a lawbreaker. And this is why many police officers throughout the United States think that they could go do things that are riding the line of the law or violating the law in the name of effective enforcement, law enforcement measures. But once they violate that law, then what happens is effectively they're becoming an oath breaker and they're a criminal. Now, should the police officers should they be retrained? Sure, they should be. But the police officers, even if they're trained in the right to travel, most of them are going to still enforce these statutes. And the reason why they're going to enforce the statutes, because the statutes are created by the local lawmakers, and those statutes will increase the revenue for the municipality. If the police officers didn't increase the revenue for the municipality, what would happen is the police officers wouldn't be paid, the salary wouldn't be so high. Not only that, they wouldn't have as many police officers. They wouldn't hire that many police officers. So the issue is that, do we have a right to travel? Sure, we do. Would any citizen try to travel without a license, registration, or insurance? Most wouldn't, because the threat of arrest or imprisonment or any or fines or anything else would deter them. Now, the police officers would tell you, if you talk about this, they would say, well, you're anti-police. And I would tell them, I'm not anti-police, I'm pro-Constitution. The Constitution created the government. The Constitution was established, the U.S. Constitution was established to ensure that our God-given and inalienable rights were protected from the majority, from the majority based on the minority's viewpoints. For example, somebody wants to right to travel, and the majority says, oh no, you can't have a right to travel, you should have a license. It's irrelevant what they say, because it's your God-given right to travel freely as long as you're not operating in commerce. When they start regulating everything, what they've effectively done is made you a subject of the municipality. Now you're subject to the municipality's statutes, rules, regulations, but it shouldn't be. What it is you should be subjected to the law, which is common law. Common law is God-made law, basic natural law. Now, if they followed that, you wouldn't need all these thousands and thousands of rules that they made up. They made so many rules up that you can't possibly follow all these rules. If you did, effectively what you would be doing is violating some while you're following the other, because they're inconsistent. So what happens is it allows the law enforcement to do arbitrary enforcement or selective enforcement on you and go after you if they don't like you. And this is the danger. Now, I'm looking for the police to start becoming more informed in the law, the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, the state Constitution, to start following their oath of office. Now, if the police continue to say that, oh, you're against the police, it's because then they want to do unlawful acts, because that's what's required of them by the commissioner, by the chief of police, by the sheriff, whoever it may be. And the reason why they're required to do it is because the municipalities deriving a benefit, and so are they. Increased revenue, more higher pay, and whatever else. Okay, this is rule of law. I would like you to look up stuff on the right to travel. Look up about the government. The government is not authorized to convert a right into a privilege, and that's effectively what they've done. I would ask you to question everything. Look up all laws. Understand that any rules, regulations, codes, statutes that are inconsistent with the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions or interpretations, or the state's Constitution, any of it is inconsistent with it, it's null and void. It has no force of law. They may be trying to apply it, but it has no force of law. And I would ask that you understand that it all starts from the Supreme Court's, U.S. Supreme Court's rulings and the state Supreme Court's rulings in your jurisdiction. So any rulings that are inconsistent with that, they can't apply legally. Shall I say, actually, they're prohibited. They can do whatever they want because they're criminals if they do stuff that's unlawful. This is Rule of Law News. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for more videos.